first speaker today. And if it sounds a bit like deja vu, it's because she was the first speaker last year. Dr. Genevieve Bell was awarded a PhD in cultural anthropology from Stanford University in 1996, but instead of pursuing a straight academic career, Dr. Bell went to work at Intel Corporation and explored the rapidly growing intersection between computing and culture. In 2015, she received an appointment as the first female senior fellow in Intel history. Now that's the part I told you about last year. This year, Dr. Bell has returned to Australia. She holds the inaugural Florence Violet Mackenzie Chair at the Australian National University. Florence Violet Mackenzie has the distinction of being the first female electrical engineer in Australian history, and the chair is named after her. And at the ANU, she has her chair in the Department of Engineering, where she has recently established the 3A Institute. Dr. Bell will be delivering the 2017 Boyer Lectures this year. You can already download the first 3 of those from the ABC website. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Genevieve Bell.
So those of you who were here last year will remember I stood on this stage and I said, yeah, the Internet of Things, it's really interesting. I want to talk to you about animals that were connected to the Internet. If you haven't seen that talk, really, cows, owls, bees, it was excellent. Unfortunately, it did not have the desired effect, which was that Etienne would say, you're never coming back to my conference. Instead, he said, you should come back again. And I'm like, oh, crap. Okay. So this time what I thought I would do was something even more outrageously mind-bending. So you've had your coffee. You've had your government minister. You've had your welcome to country. You've had Etienne's confessions and Mark's confessions of failure. And now I want to take you on a completely different adventure. Because it strikes me that what you're going to hear over the next 2 days are the right kind of conversations about IoT, about the technology, about the work that we're doing, about the ways in which that technology is and isn't being deployed, and about the people who are doing remarkable things in so doing. But what I wanted to do was take the advantage of being the first person to push the conversation just a little bit further and say, Mark's right, IoT's already here, so what comes next? And I really wanted to kind of take what I know best out of cultural anthropology and suggest what some of the next generation of questions would be. I promise I will explain what connubium is for those of you who didn't do Latin in high school and are going, what the hell is that woman talking about? So, lots of ways of introducing myself. Mark gave one of the introductions. The one you really need to know is that, in fact, I am right here. There I am. I'm the child of an anthropologist. So I grew up on my mother's field sites in central and northern Australia and also actually in Indonesia. I spent my childhood living with Indigenous people in a time when they still remembered what their country was like before cattle and fences. And it was an extraordinary childhood. I spent most of my time running around without shoes, hence my fetish of expensive shoes now. I got to hunt things and kill them and eat them. It was a genuinely excellent childhood. It's why my Twitter hashtag is feral data, because I mostly was a feral child. And it's an incredibly long way from Central Australia to Silicon Valley. As Mark said, I got my PhD at Stanford. My background at that point was Native American history, feminist and queer theory. It's obvious why Intel would hire me, almost immediately given that background. And frankly, I ended up at Intel in the way only Australians can end up somewhere. I met a man in a bar in Palo Alto in 1998. He was not a failed entrepreneur. He was a serial entrepreneur on his second startup success, and Intel was one of his angel investors. And ultimately, he introduced me to the people at Intel who gave me a job and who have kept me gainfully employed for nearly 20 years, looking at the intersections of people, technology, and culture. And my job there was always to think about what is it that inspires people and frustrates them and drives them? What are the patterns of their daily lives? And how might that inspire the next generation of technology innovation? As Mark mentioned, I've been lucky enough to come home recently and start thinking about the next adventure for myself and about the next intellectual work we all have to do, which is about how we build a new body of knowledge to respond to things like IoT and machine learning and autonomous machinery, because frankly, I don't think computer science is quite the right place for that. And I love computer scientists. I've spent the last 20 years with them. But I know there are bigger questions there about ethics and philosophy and public policy, and also ideas about what it means to talk about all of that technology. And I think we have real work to do. That is, however, not this talk. Because what I wanted to do was push just a little bit the conversation forward about IoT. We spend a lot of time talking about technology. We talk about the next range of technologies. Etienne gave you a list. Machine learning, AI, blockchain. You could add to that deep learning. There's a bunch of other things you could put on that list. But frankly, one of the other things that's going on under the hood there that I find really interesting is about the role of data. IoT is only as good as its capacity to capture, curate, circulate, and do something with all that data. Now, one of the challenges we've had up until now is that the ways we have talked about that have been quite limited. And frankly, one of the, I think, big open challenges we have in the IoT space is what are the business models that will emerge to take advantage of that nascent, effectively data-driven ecosystem. We can talk a lot about a move from a manned mission into space to blind people driving cars, and in that move we are talking about a move from analog to digital. But the world we're inhabiting now is a move from digital to data, and to a data layer, and to notions about a data-driven economy. And at the moment, if you look at the emerging business models, most of them are old and familiar. We can talk about the disruption that is Uber, but it's not really a disruption. It's in fact a deeply familiar business model, depending on which version of it you take. There's a version of it that says, commodify an existing resource that's underutilized, and there's a version that says, create a monopoly, drive down the prices until you drive out all the competitors, and then raise the prices again, depending on how you feel about Uber. Either one of those business models could be true. There are certainly ideas about leasing. There are ideas about different models of sale. But we all know that in order for this to be successful, we're actually going to have to imagine different kinds of business models and different kinds of strategies. And frankly, I think that actually means thinking about data and data circulation in different ways. So are there some new tools we could use to unpack that? And I was thinking about what did I know that would be useful. And it's nice to hear that Etienne started a little bit in the past, because I want to go even further back in the way back ethnographic machine and say that anthropology, and I don't mean here ethnography, so I know many of you have encountered ethnographers who go and hang out with people and ask them questions. This is not the bit I want to talk about. I want to talk about the deep and incredibly boring theory that my discipline produced nearly 100 years ago to explain human relationships. And it's all about how did people manage things and stuff, and how did they circulate meaning, which frankly I think are all proxies for how we think about data. So I want to tell you 5 stories from classic anthropology. I know Etienne made you all put your hands up for where you were. Does anyone take an anthropology class at university? Oh, bless you. 2, maybe 3. Okay, good. You are going to be with me. The rest of you are going to look at me like I am, in fact, speaking Urdu. Right, so 5 stories from anthropology. What you have to keep in mind is in each one of these stories, I want you to think about what is the possible connection between this story and data, because there is a connection in every single one of them. And most of them actually start around here. So if you had taken a classic anthropology class at any point in the last 100, well, not 100 years, 80 years, you would have read a book called Argonauts of the Western Pacific. It was authored by a man named Bronislaw Malinowski. It was based on his fieldwork in the Trobriand Islands, so Pacific island chain, about 18 islands. In that book, he describes something called cooler, or a cooler ring, by which a series of objects circulate around that entire 18-island archipelago. In fact, 2 things circulate. This armband here circulates in a counterclockwise direction, and necklaces circulate in a clockwise direction. So we now have 2 objects circulating in 2 different directions around an 18-island chain. At no point in time do you have both of these objects. At most points in time, you are owing someone else one of these objects. So Etienne has given me necklaces. I owe those necklaces to Mark. Lula, up the back there, owes me an armband. And they're circulating in 2 different directions. You accrue status in this network, both by your ability to be circulating things and by the moments you may have them in your possession very briefly, and you can put on a ritual in the ownership of them. It also turns out that none of this circulation is resolved in the arc of your lifetime. So in fact, Etienne's son here is going to be the one who owes me necklaces later. And I will owe something potentially from Mark's parents, because this circulation happens asynchronously, it happens over time, and what it does is establish systems of reciprocity that connect 18 islands together constantly. Men are the ones who circulate the objects, but women are the ones who ultimately own them. Malinowski charted all of that, and everyone went, that's nice, which is what you're all doing now. What you should remember here is that you should think about those necklaces and bracelets as being like data. What would a world look like where data circulated asymmetrically and asynchronously, but it established forms of reciprocity, and it was a pattern that you could track, and it happened over time? So cooler, sometimes also known as gift exchange. Anthropological story number 1. Anthropological story number 2, from the title of which this talk is taken, is the most arcane piece of anthropological vocabulary you will ever encounter. If you ever want to make an anthropologist happy, you say to them, circulating connubium, and they will get a little happy glow on them. A bit like saying quantum computing to people now, or, as I learnt last night, non-Boolean logic. Exactly. Etienne just goes, really? Okay, so circulating connubium. Connubium here is the Latin word for wives. Circulating connubium is a marriage pattern structure that existed in the Dutch East Indies that was documented in the turn of the last century. It's a system by which a series of villages are connected to one another through an exchange of wives. That would be a diagram to document it, just in case you wondered. Group A gives wives to Group B gives wives to Group C. In order for this to work, you need to have 7 groups. So C to D, D to E, E to F, F back to A. The trick about this is that you always get your wives from A, but you always give your wives to B. Which means you are always, in the ethnographic sense here, a wife giver and a wife taker, but never from the same places. Now, like most good ethnographic stories, this only works in an ideal sense. About 20% of the population is compliant to this pattern, but the pattern is the ideal marriage form. What it also means is that over time, if you are Group B, your relationship to Group A is that you always get your wives from them, which means you'd better not piss them off. So your relationship to A is a form of nurture because you need them to be your allies. Your relationship to C is completely different because they can't afford to piss you off because you're giving them wives. Now, of course, giving in this sense, let's not get, a kind of beat me up in a good feminist critique, because I am a good feminist and I can tell you about how women actually function inside this system, but the ideal is the important piece, not the actuality. So again, here, think about data. What would it mean to have a group who only gives data to a different group and never takes data back? What if this is the moral equivalent of right-only exchanges of data? This is not about reciprocity, but it is about bonding certain groups to one another because you always give data in one direction only. It's also, again, about cementing relationships between people. And again, this one functions over time. Third example, joss money. Spirit money, temple money, there's lots of forms for this. Once a year in the traditional Chinese communities, there is a festival called Qingming in which you honor your deceased relatives. In Chinese cosmology, those relatives live in a world that operates in parallel to this one. One of the ways you take care of them is by burning paper objects that the fire transforms into real objects that materialize in the hands of your ancestors. Doing this is a form of filial piety. It is a form of ensuring you're a good descendant. It is a form of taking care of your family. You can go into the places that sell this spirit money, and it is full of objects we would recognize. Cell phones, laptops. I'm willing to bet iBeacons. Etienne, if we went looking, I can always tell what's actually coming by what's available in these stores. I haven't yet seen a paper Nest thermos, but I bet they're in Hong Kong. Because the fire makes these things real, right? And so here the important thing is the logic of symbolism. The paper object is a real object. It relates to a different community that you can't see. The burning of it materializes a particular set of social obligations. So think about what it would be to collect data where the virtue of the data is only symbolic, it isn't real. Or where the performance by which you collect that data is symbolic and it isn't real. And here what you have is a system that has been extant for more than 3,000 years, where objects are not what they seem. They have a symbolic cadence, but they connect this world and another world. Fourth of these, Potlatch, not dissimilar. This one is one of the few that doesn't come from the Pacific Rim. This one is up actually in the northwest of North America. It is a system by which status is accrued in traditional Inuit and Tlingit communities. You accrue status by collecting stuff. You spend all of your time hunting and gathering, you get seal pelts, you collect various kinds of animal pieces, you make basketry, you go hell for leather. It is an impressive thing. And frankly, when the British first encountered the Tlingit, they were very excited that they thought they had found indigenous people who looked like capitalists. They were very excited because the Tlingit seemed to be very busy accumulating stuff. It took about one summer before the English realized that the Tlingit were not capitalists in any way they genuinely recognized, because the reason you accumulate all of that stuff is that when you have enough stuff, like all the stuff, you invite everyone you know to a really big party, you give all your shit away to those people, and then you burn your house down. And you can see the English going, uh-oh, That's not capitalism as we recognize it at all. We need to stop that happening. The English are very unhappy with potlatch. Every time you potlatch successfully, you get a ring for your hat. So this guy here, he'd done really well for himself. 3 times in the arc of his lifetime, he had accumulated enough shit to have a really big party, give it all away, and burn the house down. The English did not love him, as you can imagine. But here, think about the accumulation is not for the sake of the accumulation, it's for the sake of who can you give it away to. And status comes not from the accumulation, but the distribution. And the recklessness with which you do the distribution, because it was always done in one night. Like, everyone comes, everything goes, big conflagration. They were genuinely excellent ceremonies. The English attempt to regulate this was to make it illegal. The Clinkets' response to that was just to go, oh, we're in Potts Point. Well, they were secretly in Parramatta. The English never cottoned onto it. It's remarkable. And then last but by no means least, cargo cults. I know some of you will know this from things like Burning Man and other forms of popular culture, but if you had wandered through the greenery of the Papua New Guinea highlands sometime in the 1950s, you would have come into a clearing, and in that clearing there would have been a 5-meter high pole. There would have been a man standing at the bottom of that pole with headphones on. There would have been a plane sitting on the clearing space, and it would have taken you a moment of looking at all of that to realize that everything you were looking at wasn't real. The headsets on the man standing beneath the pole turned out to be made of bark. The aeroplane was made of rushes and bark. And what was going on there was a village had created the Western world because they knew that telephone poles and radio signals and aeroplanes brought things. And they understood that when you watched white people, one of the things we seemed to be really good at was creating spaces where stuff turned up. When Europeans turned up in Papua New Guinea, we plowed down the forests and the jungle, and aeroplanes landed, and those planes disgorged goods. And people went, this seems like a good system. If we mow down the jungle, maybe a plane will come and bring us stuff. And so they went about reproducing our logic in order to bring those same things to them. And of course we can laugh at it now because it seems almost crazy, except that it isn't, and except that there's all kinds of things we do in the contemporary world that we would now call magical thinking that look remarkably like this. You will imagine if you open your laptops there will be a Wi-Fi network because someone told you. Doesn't mean there will be. You hope there'll be 4G connectivity because there should be, doesn't mean there will be. We hope that little symbol means something is happening, but frankly, there are many ways in which our contemporary world feels a lot like a cargo cult. So where does all of that leave us? That's a little bit of a running adventure through ethnography. We've got patterns of moving jewelry in the Trobrians. We have circulations of women in the Dutch East Indies. We have spirit money in the Chinese diaspora. We have potlatching in the Pacific Northwest and cargo cults in Papua New Guinea. So what do all those things have in common? What they all have in common is they're about the circulation of things and people and ideas. And in some ways, they're a really good proxy for thinking about how data will move. Not how it moves now, but how it might move in the future. And they're also a way of starting to suggest what might other forms of business look like and other metaphors that we could have here. What if we imagined that part of the value we will extract out of IoT is not in real time? We already know that's coming. Precision agriculture doesn't necessarily rely on constant real-time things. It relies on historic data. It relies on temporary downloads. It relies on forms of asynchronousness. So what if we imagine that the time dimension isn't always in real time? We know that has technical implications. Does that mean we need constant connectivity for every piece of an IoT deployment? Maybe not. Maybe it just broadcasts once a day. Maybe it only needs to broadcast once a year. Maybe it doesn't need to be a full radio stack. Maybe it can be something else. So if time is different, what does that open up both in terms of technologies but in terms of business models? Now imagine that the next thing is about who is getting that data and what are they doing with it. At the moment, we imagine that more data somehow equals more insight and more truth. Well, what if what data could signal is in fact relationships between different parties? What if it could signal reciprocities? What if in fact, much like spirit money, all it did was signal relationships and ideas of connectedness? Who collects the data, where it sits? Again, has huge technical implications. At the moment, most of the conversations we're having at a technical level about IoT have to do with Is the data stored locally? Do we need analytics at the edge? Where are the algorithms going? Where is the data being stored? And how do we need to access it again? Those are, again, technical decisions predicated on a set of business models that we've always already had. What would it mean if we started to imagine that data might move differently? What if some of that data is never going to move? What if some of it is collected and never used? What if some of that data is actually about something other than what the data signals? What if it's the equivalent of spirit money? What would that look like? So time might be different. Where the data moves might be different. I think there are some really interesting questions here about what data could signal at a symbolic level. Is the exchange of data about what the data says or about what the data says about your relationships? So think about how governments collect data, about how they choose to store it, about where it is stored, about who has access to it. Again, those are all big, open, complicated questions. So that little tiny adventure through my field was really just about saying, as we talk about IoT, as we talk about the next 10 years, Etienne is right to start by saying it's not all about the technology. It's also about human beings. It's also about business models. And it's also about what are the things that the underlying technology will make possible. And frankly, how do we challenge ourselves really significantly to take a moment and ask, what are some other ways of thinking about this? Where else could we learn and pay attention to that might open up some different conversations so that when we talk about IoT as a disruption, we're actually talking about genuine disruption as opposed to a repackaging of the 20th century one more time with feeling. And with that, I want to say thank you.